So this is a quick demo dojo to go over the differences between the include, require, and contain mechanisms of referring to or incorporating another Puppet class into a catalog. So just to kind of show what the differences are, all three of these functions are really designed to, in one class, refer to or make reference to another class that includes additional functionality. So to set things up, I've got this example here. Two classes, example : 1 and example : 2. For the sake of demonstration, they just each have one or more notify resources. Example 1 has one notify resource, and example 2 has two notifies. So if I were to create, just do a simple Puppet apply -e include example : 2. This is a piece or a snippet of what the resulting catalog would look like. This is a visual representation of a Puppet class in a catalog. The notable components are every resource in the class exists, and it has there's two what are called wits, and these are kind of internal graph mechanisms of Puppet. There's a wit for admissible class, which is basically start, and wit completed class, which is stop. So everything in between these two wits is going to be, or rather, when a resource is created as part of a class, it automatically receives a relationship that places it after the first wit and before the last wit. And the kind of this sandwich, it represents the class. So what happens when I want to do something like, if I were to say inside this example : 2 class, previously I just had two resources, the notifies. What if I add include example : 1? What does that actually mean? What happens? When you compile that into a catalog, what that means is simply now you have two unrelated classes. So we have here example : 2, the beginning wit, the end wit, and kind of the sandwich containing those two resources. And we have unrelated to that, kind of off to the side, doesn't really matter what, before, after, anything like that. We have another class, example : 1. So we've got the same sandwich scenario with these wits, and we've got, in this case, just a single resource in between them, but there's no relationship. So again, that's what happens when you include another class. It makes sure it exists in the catalog, but it does not specify any particular relationship between the two classes. Puppet will figure out what to do, and it's basically random which one gets implemented or goes first. So what about require? Require is a superset of include. It's going to do exactly the same thing include does. It's going to make sure that class exists in the catalog, but what it's also going to do is establish a relationship between them. So specifically, again, a class is these two wits, this sandwich, and the resources go in between it. It's going to establish a relationship between the completed wit, for example : 1, and the begin wit, for example : 2. Again, that's class example 2 requiring example 1. It's just going to make sure that the whole of the class example 1 is going to be executed before is going to be a requirement of example 2. So that's require. It's basically the same thing that happens when you have a resource require. The main difference between a resource require and a class require is that a class is really the sandwich construct where you have two nodes that represent it and everything else is kind of a sandwich in between. So contain is the other one. Contain is basically it's a little bit different from require, but like require, it is a superset of, or can be thought of as a superset of include. It's going to make sure the class exists in the catalog, but it's also going to establish some relationships. So specifically, if you contain one class inside another, you're going to get two relationships established. First off, the beginning wit for your containing class is going to create an edge to the beginning wit of your contained class, and the ending edge or ending wit of your containing class will have an edge here. You can see the visual. Basically, the dependencies will be set up such that the contained class cannot begin until the containing class has begun, and the contained class will finish before the containing class finishes. So it is literally contained inside it by virtue of these two resource edges. And again, that's the contain. So class example : 2 is containing example : 1. So this is a bunch of like the literal technical, what is actually happening, the differences between include, which is just, again, make sure they're in the same catalog, and require, which is establish a simple, this one first, then this one relationship between the two classes, and contain, which is literally this thing the contain class won't begin until the containing class has, and won't end before the containing class does. So the use cases for these sort of relationship things it's largely the same use cases as relationships for classes, but notably, I guess let me diverge for a second. I forgot to talk about this. If you have a single resource, regardless of whether it's in another class or somewhere else, and you specify a before relationship on a class, what's going to happen is that resource is going to end up with an edge pointing at the beginning of that class. So this notify external is going to happen before the class example : 2 begins. Similarly, if you specify a require relationship on a class, then your resource is going to have have an edge basically against the completion wit for that class. You'll note that when you're specifying a single resource depending on a class, because a class is a construct, it's not a single node in the graph, you're getting these that translates into a dependency on one of these two wits, one of these two sandwich edges. Okay, so that might kind of help explain things a little bit more even. There's one other picture I'll just toss on here. Of course, all of this was, these visualizations were taken from a larger graph. We'll come back to this and how you generate one of these in a second. But let's take a look at some code here and say, well, when should I use include, when should I use require, when should I use contain? So I just tossed a bunch of code on the screen here. But let's talk about contain or include first. So include is very easy. It's basically when you want composable content that doesn't have a relationship between anything else to be in the same catalog. It's really basically for unrelated things or order-independent things, where it doesn't matter what order things get laid down on. Require is, like, let's say you have a class, or for a definition of a time-sensitive application, where you need to have NTP configured before you even start dealing with this one. Require NTP is kind of a shortcut, an easy way of saying anything in the NTP class, make sure that it's all done before you begin. Now, where this breaks down, and this is kind of comes down to the definition of NTP, is where does contain come in? Well, if I say that this particular class requires NTP, all I've really done is I've said that whatever resources are directly inside this class, or excuse me, you know what, I didn't build a visualization for this, but let's say that this example 1 class actually has subclasses that it farms out functionality to. Because for these sandwich components, the only thing that ends up sandwiched between these two wits are the resources that are declared directly in the class. So if the class itself has any includes or contains or requires that, or any include or refers to another class with the class instantiation syntax, that won't actually automatically create any sort of relationship with these wits. So if you want one of these wit relationships to be created, like in between classes, you need to specify that explicitly. So let's say NTP, for whatever reason, is actually comprised of 3 different classes. Class NTP exists, but all it's going to do is call out to NTP : install, NTP : configure, and NTP : service. This is a common pattern that I personally actually don't like very much, but you see it everywhere. So if time-sensitive app requires NTP, well, none of these things are actually resources, which means I haven't actually done anything. There's still no guarantee that any of my resources inside time-sensitive app will have an appropriate relationship with the NTP construct. If I just did include here, all that would mean, again, include is just make sure all of these classes exist, but they have no relationship with each other. So if I included these 3 classes, NTP install, configure, and service, then they would be laid out alongside each other in the catalog, and my relationship require NTP would only be against one of them. The other 3 are basically drifting free in the catalog and unrelated to that dependency. So in this case, what I'd actually want to do is say contain NTP install, NTP configure, and NTP service, because what I want is whenever I want these kind of 3 classes to be represented as a part of or within the NTP kind of superclass. So that if I have a time-sensitive application that says require NTP, then that requirement won't actually be satisfied until all 3 of these contained classes are completed, because NTP itself won't be considered completed until each of the contained classes is, based on the relationship that's established between their ending wits when you do contain. And similarly, I'm trying to remember why I put this individual resource out here. But this is just kind of indicating that if you're ever going to have resources that specify, before or require against a particular class, this is where the realization that resource metaparameters against a class are just referring to one side of that wit comes in. Just something to be aware of when you're kind of building your dependencies in your classes. So I think I'll leave that alone for right now. Really the main takeaway from this was the visualizations, that when you include a class, it's just dropping it into the catalog with no relationship whatsoever to anything else in the catalog. When you require a class, you're actually establishing a single relationship where the requiring class, which is in this case this one here, example 2, the requiring class has to occur or has a dependency on the ending wit of the required class. And then contain allows you to treat one class as a kind of wrapper. But you can have resources that specify dependencies against it, or classes that include require it, and all of its internal classes will be appropriately lined up in the graph. And then I toss this on the screen for just a second. The last thing to mention is, if you're curious as to how to build these sorts of graphs, all of this stuff that I'm showing you is generated by Puppet itself using the --graph flag. Whenever you run Puppet with --graph, Puppet apply or something like that, it'll actually create one of these, a dot file, which is where this came from, and drop it into a particular specified directory. So what that looks like is the command for that, something like, in this case I ran Puppet apply, I gave it a module path for my demonstration modules, I gave it --graph, which basically means generate the graphs, and then --grafter, which tells it where to put them. And what you end up getting from that is, so that was vagrant graphs. You get a couple of things. You get relationships ... which is kind of a simple relationships graph. You get resources ... Expanded relationships is what you really need to look at to understand these class relationships, because the wits aren't otherwise shown. And there's actually a bug out there right now. In fact, the wits are never shown. You can never understand what's going on, because today, and since quite a while ago, Puppet produces a graph that looks like this, where you have all of these cycles showing. And that's a bug. In order to fix this, I actually applied manually a patch that's fired against Puppet 4. This ticket, by the way, is pup 914. Is going to talk all about these graphs and why it doesn't actually show you what you want to see. But there's a patch out there for pup 914 that basically just is a simple replacement of a bunch of 2s's to .ref, which will actually fix this and show the wits so you can see sort of the entire graph. And I specifically opened these up with GraphVid or OmniGraffle, which has the ability to read in dot files and kind of produce these sorts of views directly. All right, so again, that was an attempt at visually demonstrating sort of what the difference between include, require, and contain is, to help you kind of better understand which to use in what situation. The last thing I'll mention in parting is just that these two are, in general, you should use include unless you have a specific reason to use require or contain. If you don't have a reason to use one of these two, you probably shouldn't be using them, because the more edges you have in the graph, the more likely you are to accidentally introduce a dependency cycle. So unless you know what edge you're trying to introduce, don't worry too much about these. There are definitely use cases for them, but be intentional about their use. Don't default to them. Thanks.